Welcome back to Northshire Live. It is at least a sunny day, though a chilly one here in Saratoga. I don't know what it's like over in Vermont for the folks joining us from there, but it is great to see you all and to have everyone together again. This is our second Northshire Live this week. We decided we were having fun with it, so why not do two? So welcome back. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel. I'm the event manager for Northshire's Saratoga store. And I've been co-hosting these with the wonderful David.
Hello, welcome to Northshire Live. Pleasure to see you all again. Some of you.
So tonight we are joined by two wonderful authors of historical fiction, which is very exciting to me. It's one of my go-to reading choices a lot of the time. And especially now, we are actually just talking about how strange a lot of contemporary fiction feels at the moment. Because, you know, you read, they're standing too close. No, you can't go to brunch, don't do that. So historical fiction where you can be like, no, it's fine for them to be hugging each other because it's 1920 is very much where my head has been in a lot of my reading process lately. So it's a particular treat. What I thought that we would do tonight is that I will introduce the authors one at a time. They will each read a little bit from their most recent book and then talk a little bit about their writing. And then once they've both had a chance to talk, they will talk to each other for a little bit about writing historical fiction, research, what it's like writing right now, whatever else is on their mind, and then we'll open things up to questions. So we have the chat off to the side of your screen, and that is a place that you can ask questions if you'd rather not ask one on camera. We are recording this, which it'll be put on our Facebook page at a later date. It will only show the images of the people who are speaking. So if you're not speaking, you won't show up on camera. And if you'd rather not show up in that, we've actually mostly been editing people out because we don't want to invade your privacy. But you can always ask a question in the chat and either David or I will try to read it out. Also, David is putting handy dandy links into the chat to order TaraShea and Kim's books. The web orders that we've been getting at northshire.com have been the lifeblood that are keeping the store limping along. We certainly hope to reopen both stores as soon as it's safe and reasonable to do so, and we're really grateful to the people who've been placing those orders on our website and keeping us alive. So thank you all very, very, very much for that. So I am going to go ahead and introduce TaraShea, who's going to go first, if that's okay with everybody. TaraShea Nesbit is an author whose work I first encountered with her riveting historical novel, The Wives of Los Alamos, which was her debut novel, and it won the Penn Robert Bingham Prize. When the first advanced copies of her brand new novel, Beheld, arrived in our back offices, they were so eagerly passed from hand to hand, and even, I have to say, a little bit fought over, and one after another of the booksellers were just entranced by it. At the time of the shutdown, we'd actually been planning a lunch event as part of her book tour for the book. It was going to be lunch at Hattie's, which it was one of the events that I was the saddest to cancel when I was canceling everything. So I am extremely happy to have her here with us tonight to tell us about the new book. We're just going to unmute her, and then TaraShea, you can take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Rachel and David, for organizing this, and all of you readers out there, and Kim, I'm so happy to be learning from you and hearing more from you about writing historical fiction as well. So all of that. So if you probably know this already, but just a general, the book is telling the story of the first murder that takes place in Plymouth, Massachusetts, of a colonist. It's not actually the first murder, but it's the first murder of a colonist. 1630, 10 years after the Mayflower passengers arrived. And it's narrated primarily from two women of very different status and means. So one is the governor's second wife, crucially his second wife, Alice Bradford. And the other is a recently freed indentured servant. She served 7 years and so she is now free. And she comes from England, and she's not a separatist Puritan. And she's kind of wanting to set the story straight. And I'll read a snippet from those two perspectives so you can hear what that feels like. Alice Bradford. We thought ourselves a murderless colony. In God's good favor, we created a place on a hill overlooking the sea and the direction from which we came. For a while, God's favor seemed possible, but it pleased him to have other plans. I remember that day in the year of our Lord, 1630, that the first colonist was murdered. We were divided as we had been from the beginning. Half of the colonists were congregants striving to live as God intended, and the other half, well, they were why we took care to mend the fences. We heard another door and looked outward. She's with her friend. Across the way, Eleanor Billington had stepped out of her house. Eleanor Billington, black curly hair loosely tied back and falling forward on her shoulders. She wore a bosom-bursting dress, free at the waist but tight at the chest. She darted to her fireword. An urgency there was not to stare, for the U-shaped cut that revealed her bosom. She picked up wood and went back inside before Susanna could give commentary. Susanna nodded her head as if to say, see, this is the woman who is not doing her share, as if God was making now her presence known. What do you think will happen first? Her husband killed or kicked out of the colony, said Susanna. I told her that was a terrible thing to say. Her son, who had passed just 2 years prior. But God doth punish. So many people died that first winter in Plymouth, but like the most pernicious weeds, the Billingtons had survived. Why had God spared them? And now I'll switch to Eleanor Billington's perspective. So she's the woman that's being talked about. I'm leaving my house, right? John and our son already out in the fields. I'm getting the logs, as one doth, minding my own, when those three steely faces turned to me. Oh, their chaste little bosoms, their pious little smiles. Women who think they are better than us, the servants. But we weren't their servants, nay, not any longer. 1 year out of indentured servitude, but watching them look at me, you'd never know it. I took enough of those glances in London. I shut needing them now, mistresses, I yelled across the garden. Alice, the governor's wife, covered her chest. Susanna put her hand on her hip. Elizabeth went back to her weed-pulling. Revelry it was to rile them. Sing for your supper, that is what my mum did. Sang for her bloody supper, and I did what I had to do, did I not? To pay Weston for this journey. Given how we lived on the Mayflower, on the wet ship floor with the rats nibbling our toes, he should have paid us. When my feet first fell upon this land, I had in mind to return to the ship's master and say, take me back. We agreed to 7 years of labor with respectable, ordinary English people. We agreed to 7 years of servitude in Virginia, not Plymouth. But oh no, William Bradford had an answer. My kind, my common kind, we are never given what we are promised. So that's a little taste of it. And I think you said I should chat a little bit about it, and then Kim will read a bit too. So unlike my first book, The Wives of Los Alamos, which I wrote in about a month, a first draft of, which was ridiculous. After a couple of years of research, I endeavored to tell the story of the making of the atomic bomb from the nuclear scientist's wife's perspective, and that was that book. This book, I was in a class finishing up my PhD in creative writing and literature at the University of Denver. And I was taking a class on early American literature, and I was reading William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation. And, many of you are probably familiar with that book, in which he narrates in a third person plural, which is interesting to me. He's like, they called themselves the Pilgrims, of which he's a part. But when he's doing that, he tells us in a lot of detail about the people who died that first winter, except he does not mention the cause of death of his first wife, Dorothy. And I found that out through a footnote. There was the editor said, well, he doesn't really talk about how she died. And then significantly later, someone says that she slipped off of the ship, but it turns out the ship was moored. And they were on the Mayflower, and her husband had gone away scouting for land. And it was her and the other women and some of the people that worked on the ship. And I just was haunted by what could have happened to her. I didn't exactly even want to write a novel about it. I had finished my first novel, but I felt daunted by the amount of history, the amount of detail that I didn't know. Like, did they have forks? Where were they at in terms of thinking about science? You know, can I understand their worldview and those things? But I just couldn't let her go. And then I was looking through the Plymouth court records and the Plymouth laws. And that's when I came across a little detail about the first murder trial. And it was a combination of this first wife who had perished, and the details were pretty unknown, and the people that were involved in that first murder trial were also on the Mayflower, or at least one of those people were, that I felt a kind of everything coming together to tell this novel and this story. And it took about 6 years, so it wasn't a book that I finished quickly at all. And it had 3 different drafts. It had a first draft that was only on the ship and was told from Dorothy's perspective, and a second draft that was told in third person from all of the shipmates, and then the third draft that was from the second wife's perspective and this indentured servant. And I think another aspect of it was realizing the class differences. There were about 20 or 25% of the people on the ship that were indentured servants. And things started to emerge beyond what was in the history. And I thought about it like, if William Bradford had left out the details of how his first wife perished, what else was he leaving out of the narrative? And as I'm sure many of you know, there was a lot he was leaving out of that narrative. And we can kind of debate about why, but that was kind of my starting place for the story. And I could talk more in the Q&A about all of that.
Fantastic, thank you, TaraShea. So we're now going to turn things over to Kim Van Alkemade. She is the author of the acclaimed bestseller Orphan No. 8, and she first came to us at Northshire around the time of the release of her wonderful second novel, Bachelor Girl, which is another book that multiple Northshire booksellers fell in love with. And actually, since that first event, she has moved to Saratoga, and she has become a great friend to the bookstore. And so it's been a real privilege for me to get to know her further, both as a really amazing writer and also as a reader and as a community member. So it's a great treat to have Kim Van Alkemade here tonight to talk to us about her work.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. There was just one of those birthday parties outside where people drive by somebody's house and honk all their horns. I think it's over, but if you hear like some honking in the background, maybe it's like round 2 of the birthday party. So yeah, it's been such a pleasure to work with Rachel and everybody at Northshire, to be part of the local book community. It's a really important part of a writer's life and a reader's life. So it's been a pleasure. So this is Bachelor Girl, and I picked out just the first couple pages to read. Bachelor Girl, it was inspired by a true event. In 1939, Colonel Jacob Ruppert, who owned the New York Yankees and was reputed to be like a huge millionaire. He had all kinds of real estate in New York City. He was, in his time, really kind of famous. He died and unexpectedly left a fortune to an unmarried, unknown ex-actress named Helen. And most of the people who reported on Ruppert were sports journalists, so guys, and they all thought, oh, she must have been his girlfriend. They called her his like special friend. And the more I ended up stumbling into it through a different research project, which if you're interested, you can ask me. But the more I learned about Jacob Ruppert and his actual life and his actual history, the more I thought maybe there might be a different explanation, a different relationship, a different reason to befriend and make an heiress of this actress So that's what the book is. So there's these kernels of truth with a very fictional story woven around them. And that tends to be my approach. I think TaraShea could probably relate to that, that you have a historical event or moment, and then the character, you have to imagine them in your own mind. So that's who these characters are. So this, I'll just read the first couple pages. They're set in 1939 at the reading of Jacob Ruppert's will. And this is in Helen's voice. Steam heat fogged the tall windows as Albert and I joined the crowd assembled in the lawyer's office. A clerk with a clipboard ran around, establishing that everyone listed in the will was in attendance. Helen Winthrope, he asked. I nodded. It felt strange to see him check off my name. I hadn't expected Jake to leave me anything, not after all he'd done for me while he was alive. It took a while for the lawyer to read through all the small bequests, gifts of $500 or $1,000 to the many people who'd served Colonel Jacob Ruppert so well. Besides his chauffeur, he'd made provision for his laundress and his cook, for the brewmaster who was his oldest employee, and for the zookeeper who cared for his many animals. Jake had disbanded his kennel of St. Bernards years ago, selling off the breeding stock and retaining only a few aging show dogs as pets. The peacocks would be left to wander Eagle's Rest, I supposed, the next owners of the estate forced to take them on. The monkeys would be going to the Bronx Zoo, I learned. Thinking of them reminded me of when my little dog Pip died. I'd wrapped his body in a blanket and rushed up the Hudson to Eagle's Rest to show his corpse to the rhesus female who loved him so. I knew she'd never stop pestering me if she didn't understand in her own way that he was dead. She'd reached through the bars of her cage and taken my limp Pip in her arms, mourning him like a lost infant. I returned my attention to the proceedings at the lawyer's office. Jake left his collection of Chinese vases and jade carvings to the Metropolitan Museum, as expected. The bequest of over $100,000 to Lenox Hill Hospital seemed unaccountably large, I thought, given their failure to cure the phlebitis that killed him. When the lawyer announced that Albert had been left $10,000, I took his hand, delighted that his years of loyal service as Jake's personal secretary had been so generously acknowledged. A man could buy a comfortable house on Long Island for less than that. My mind wandered as I pictured myself helping Albert pick out curtains and carpets. Perhaps we could plant a garden. I imagined a patch of grass bordered with tiger lilies and black-eyed Susans, an apple tree that would flower in spring and fruit in fall. The sum of $300,000. I was drawn back to the lawyer's office as a collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. I leaned over to Albert, my voice a whisper. What did he say? $300,000. Oh, who is that for? I asked. I thought the museum and the hospital would be the biggest legacies. Albert searched my face as if some secret message were written there. You, Helen. It's for you. That's like an abbreviated version from the prologue. But yeah, this bequest really caught my attention. And Helen, the real woman, her name was Helen Weyant. She lived in New Rochelle until the 1980s, never married. For a while, she and two of Ruppert's nieces owned the New York Yankees baseball team. And yet when I went to Cooperstown to the baseball museum, the Baseball Hall of Fame, they have an archive there. They had a folder on Helen's brother who worked for the Yankees for a while. They had a big folder on Ruppert, obviously, but nothing on Helen, even though she actually owned the team for a while. And that it was just so interesting to me that there was so little known about her. And it suited me also as a novelist, so I could really imagine a lot. So it was this interesting for me combination of historical research. So even in the passage I read, all those details about Jacob Ruppert's will are factual. He did keep a zoo at his estate on the Hudson River called Eagle's Rest. That estate is still there. When you take the Amtrak if we ever take the Amtrak to New York City again, you pass right underneath Eagle's Rest. You can look up and see the estate. It's really cool. And now it's a residential school run by Greek Orthodox nuns. And they gave me a tour. Me and my mom went and we got a tour of the building. And so, yeah, he kept apes and monkeys and peacocks. He used to show dogs at the Westminster Kennel Club. He was just an interesting person, sort of bridged the Gilded Age into the Jazz Age and then through the Great Depression. So it was a great historical sweep. And by imagining Helen as a character, I knew very little about the actual person. And then also by developing the character of Ruppert's personal secretary, who was a man named Albert, but in my book, it's a completely fictionalized man, just also named Albert. I was able to also explore gay New York at that time in the 1920s through the character of Albert. So I brought together all these things that were really interesting for me about the Jazz Age that maybe don't always get as much attention. So that's Bachelor Girl.
Fantastic, thank you, Kim. So now I'm going to make sure, TaraShea, if you could unmute yourself, or I can unmute you. Yeah, there we go. So if the two of you want to talk amongst yourselves, but with all of us here about any writing, researching questions you have for each other.
Yeah, I have two, and I can't choose, so we'll see. I'm going to run in with this one. I think both of our novels in some ways are adding back a non-hetero perspective that existed in the past but isn't present in a lot of the accounts of the past. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering for you if that was an intention you set or if that's something that more emerged. Mm-hmm. And if there were other writers that were informing that. I think of I Love Sarah Waters, for instance.
Yeah.
For you.
Yeah, definitely Sarah Waters. It's pretty much my project in historical fiction to center gay and lesbian characters in the past where, we did exist, but you often don't read that much about it. For a lot of contemporary readers, they feel Stonewall was 1969 or something, and that's when gay people started being alive. I don't know. And so to situate characters in these historical moments is really interesting for me. And one of the things I do for my research is I get novels that are contemporary to that time, or books that are contemporary to that time. So in Bachelor Girl, I ended up reading a lot of novels written in the 1930s, centering on gay and lesbian characters, where you could get a publisher and they could be very intricate and very sympathetic as long as the queer character dies at the end, usually from suicide because they're so sad to be queer. And yet it gave me these amazing insights into that life. So that was a real intentional choice to take this character of Jacob Ruppert's secretary, who's just a guy, I don't even know anything about him, and to sort of insert my fictional character there in order to explore that.
Unmute. I keep muting myself because of the echo. So the other thing I was really interested in is how in interviews you've talked about, I know very little about real Helen's life, mm-hmm. which is how I like it because my character is fictional. Yeah. Also, shout out to the Saint Bernards because I used to have a Saint Bernard. But other than these two facts, I enjoyed having free reign to invent Helen Winthrope's character. And I feel like historical fiction writers take there's a huge range in how much you feel that you have to have this, you have to do your research or how much research you do. I know somebody that only researches after she's done. And yet I also always, when I get this question about research, I feel like it's the most boring answer. I don't know how to make it interesting to talk about what I do. So my question for you is, could you talk about either of those things, why you like it to just be this is fiction, or how you talk about the kind of research, or how those are working together.
Yeah, I know. And then I want to ask you about Plymouth Colony, because you have very few people to work with, and so I don't know. I'm really curious to what extent you were able to develop fictional characters or points of view. I taught and wrote creative nonfiction for a number of years. And so I'm really conscious of the idea in creative nonfiction that I used to teach my students is that it's about your contract with the reader. What are you promising the reader? So in nonfiction, creative nonfiction, you're saying, okay, this is how I remember it. I'm using a lot of creative storytelling techniques, but I'm promising you that these things are true as I remember them. And readers are like, okay, awesome, let's go. And if you get caught out lying, then readers are incensed and they feel betrayed. And yet if you give them fiction, you say, I made this all up, they're like, okay, fine, let's go. So what I try to do with the historical fiction, especially like in the author's note, is kind of be clear about what was the research and then what was the fiction. But the research it's weird. The research is everything. I think I was at the New York State Summer Writers Conference a few years back, and Russell Banks, I could be wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong, but he said he was being fact-checked by the New Yorker for a story he wrote, and they said, what's true? And he said, everything and nothing. And that's what I think historical fiction kind of is. But with the Plymouth colony, I was so interested in that perspective of the indentured servants, and especially I had no idea that some people were on a boat, thought they were going one place and ended up someplace else. And my stepdad, Tim's ancestors were indentured servants on the Mayflower. So it was like, I was really like, especially really drawn to that point of view. So how were you able to research that? Were those voices available, or did you need to really animate them with your imagination?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those things are true. I came across that when I was not researching for the novel, but I'm kind of a magpie. So I was reading The History of White People by Nell Painter, and that led me to the book White Trash, which is also a history of the idea of whiteness and lower socioeconomic class, and how that created systems in which you might start to try to understand why a Trump supporter would vote against his or her, mostly his, but his or her interests. So I was reading those kinds of texts, and that led me to primary research on indentured servitude and early indentured servitude in America. And that led me to go back and be like, wait a minute, all these servants that aren't listed, what can I find out? So what I found out is that they were signing up or not signing up. Some of them were forced into it. But the standard was 7 years of servitude. The youngest indentured servant on the Mayflower in real life was a 4-year-old boy. And he was sent away. It was a 4-year-old boy and his 3 siblings, all a little bit older, and they were sent away by their father without their mother's knowledge, because it was claimed that the kids' father was the neighbor and not the father that was, and of course there's this complicated story of like the father was actually the cousin who was marrying another cousin to keep land in the family. So you come to understand why people cheat on each other, like they're related and they don't. But he wanted to rise in politics, and the one higher up politician that was in the family, Lord Zouch, or Zouch, depending on how you say it, Lord Zouch said, if you can't take care of if you can't manage your own affairs at home, how are you going to do it with the state? And so he was like, all right, I can take care of my affairs. I'm shipping all these kids off. And how much information the separatist Puritans, like what we think of as the Pilgrims, who were coming from Holland, how much information they had about that kind of deal, I don't totally know. But there were these arrangements that would help them pay off their debt. Because that was another aspect of the story I hadn't really considered, which is how much there was already a class system at work on the ship, and how much debt they were getting themselves into to be there. And then I would look through things like the court records of abused servants that were being abused in all of these physical and mental ways. And so I was starting to imagine from there what could have been the range of experiences. But from the perspective of women, you know, there's nothing in writing that I know of aside from the first wife's signature when she signed at the Amsterdam courthouse, her name, Dorothy Bradford. And I know that her father was there. But in some mix-up in my brain, I think, when I read that detail and I looked at that court document 5 or 6 years ago, I imagined that the second wife was there. And I don't know because I can't re-find it, but so from that point, I was able to imagine, I started to imagine this very close girlhood friendship that was a point of grief and extreme love for Dorothy and Alice, but as told from Alice's perspective. So it's a long way of saying indentured servitude. Yeah, it all came about in that stepping stone kind of puzzly way where you have all these pieces and you think, this is a mess. In fact, I called one of my friends as I was working on the novel and I said, I was just lamenting the whole process of trying to write it and bring all of these things together. And she said, it sounds like it's killing you. Maybe you should quit. I was like, no. I suddenly was like, I will finish this novel. And I was like, it was this like tough love boost that I needed to finally start to see that like I would never give up on it, and that it was all I could work these things in. I just needed to be really patient with the story.
Yeah, I relate to that. There's a point in the writing, you know, where it is like overwhelming and you're sitting in your room by yourself and you're like, you know, why am I like putting myself through this? And you know, I feel like the story is waiting for me to tell it. You know, if I don't tell Helen's story, who's going to tell her story? Because, you know, I've kind of invented her. And if I don't tell this story about Albert and even my perspective on Jacob Ruppert, who is a public figure and a historical figure, but in researching him as a historical figure, I came to a lot of my own sort of ideas about his temperament and his experiences. And yeah, if I don't finish writing it, it doesn't get told. So yeah, I that sense that you kind of get obligated to the story. And it's there like saying, come on, get back to your desk. That and your editor, if you have an editor, saying, where's my story?
That's right, because your second book, that sounds like it was on contract, whereas we're just totally chatting. Sorry, we're hogging the show.
Yeah, Rachel can break us in. So the second book was like the proposal for the book with some sample chapters, and so that the first book, you know, nobody knows I'm doing it. I'm at home by myself for like 5 years, and that draft that was really not what the final book became, but I'd written it as best as I could at that point. And then with the second one, it was like, here's some sample chapters and a proposal. And so then I was like, I knew when it had to be finished. I just didn't know if I was going to get there. And it was pretty close. So now I've learned to stick up for myself a little bit more about deadlines, because yeah, I know better now.
And you just don't know they're mutable in some ways until, you know, like if you feel like, I'm like, I've committed to it, I will do it.
Yeah.
I wasn't under contract for the second book, but I felt that. And there were times I wish I was like, I wish somebody was making me finish this book.
Yeah.
But, oh,
It's clarifying to be on contract. I find it helpful.
Mm-hmm.
No. I don't know, Rachel.
So I think
there's some other.
Yeah, I was about to say, I think we should open it up to the audience for questions. People can raise their hands and we'll unmute you. You can ask questions in the chat. Any of those are fine. Did I just see a hand? If not, I have a question actually for TaraShea, which I'm happy to jump in with while people are thinking about their questions. Which is, so I'm only about halfway into Beheld right now. But I've obviously read The Wives of Los Alamos. And one of the things that I've noticed as a consistency between the two is how much you play with narrative voice. You know, having the first person, third narration for Wives of Los Alamos, having the multiple points of view and slipping between internal and external narration in Beheld. And I wondered if that's something that's just sort of what gives you joy as a writer, if that's a deliberate choice, if that's something that you sort of found yourself doing, you're like, oh, this is what I do now. But I was curious how that came to be.
Yeah, I think that what you said about like that just gives you joy as a writer, I definitely feel energetic when I'm opening myself up to multiple perspectives. Like I just need a bit of openness or air. I need to like let in some light and air. And I think that when I'm alternating perspectives, or if I'm telling it in a first person plural, from a first person plural perspective, that the narrative in some ways is always undermining itself, building itself up, and then contradicting itself. So it was like this, we all had these stoves named Black Beauty. We were all arguing with the military not to extend the firing range, we all. And then another, we will say, but it wasn't like that at all. For some of us, da 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 da. And that was really exciting for me to say, because I was reading oral histories, and I was listening to all of these women talk about their experiences, and they would talk about them in the week, but they totally would disagree and claim that that was the way it was. And so I was just like, I'm not going to try to pick. At some point I was like, I have to pick and choose. And then I thought, actually, I don't have to pick and choose. I can let them all reside, because that's how like an experience exists for all of us. Like we're sitting here having hopefully lovely experiences, but they're slightly different experiences. And so with Beheld, I tried it for one point of view, and it just felt too claustrophobic within one perspective. And I thought, how can I open this up? And I'm someone who makes a lot of notes where I have to trick myself. Like I'm not writing a novel, I'm just playing around. Otherwise, there's a stiffness, and I just feel like I have to write something great, and then I write nothing of any value. So I have to say I'm just noodling around. And when I'm noodling around, it happens that I just want to, like, I want nature to have her own chapter, and I want John Winthrope's diary, like basically verbatim, to be in there. And I don't want the men to speak in first person. And I'm just like, this is how I think I can let in light and air to the story, by having multiple versions of what happened in the same timeline of one day. And I mean, it was such a pleasure to see that Bradford was giving this third person plural perspective. And so I felt at some point I was like, maybe I should do a they. It was like this for them. But that seemed so authoritative and assertive. And I thought that was exactly what I wanted to undermine. So I didn't choose the third person plural.
We had a couple of questions here in the chat about what y'all's next plans are for next books. Both Bill and Sydney, who came in, chiming in, and Sydney wants to know, and your perspective on how you might be planning the research around it.
Yeah, it's so fun. Like if people come to ever see you at a book thing, it's because they read your last book and they want to know about your next book. But while they're there, sometimes they'll buy the book you just wrote. So it's like this cycle. I'm kind of so yeah. I'm working on my third novel. I actually last year was working on what I thought would be my third novel, and it just didn't work. It wasn't working. I couldn't pull it together, and so I put that away. And I've just recently thought about how to come back to it eventually. But right now, so I'm working on what will be my third novel, and I'm deep in the research, and it's in a lot of ways inspired by my parents in very different ways. So my dad grew up, he was born in the Netherlands and was a little kid, a boy, during the German occupation. They lived in Rotterdam during the bombardment, and then he emigrated to the United States. And he was not Jewish, but when I would visit my relatives in the Netherlands, like, you know, you go to the Anne Frank house, and I'd be like, well, what would have happened to me? Because my mom's family, the family we grew up near in New York, is Jewish. And so this sense that in some ways it's like, okay, I'm half Dutch, but am I really? And so this question of like historical identity was really interesting for me. That time period is very interesting to me. But then I was actually, my mom and I were driving up to Saratoga in the car and talking about when she first started working in New York City in the Empire State Building in 1960, and just kind of that era. So those are the two sort of narrative perspectives that I'm working with. And right now I'm kind of just deep in the Holocaust era research, which is like really sad. But I'm trying to focus mostly on the Dutch experience. It's particular and a little bit unique. And today my great discovery, you talk about like women's perspectives. My great discovery today was Gertrude Slotka, Fraulein Gertrude Slotka, who was the one of the administrators at the Westerbork transit camp in the Netherlands, who was in charge of putting together the deportation lists to put people on trains to go to Auschwitz. And, you know, it's all about men. It seems to be always all about men. And I was like, Gertrude, that was really bad. But I'm like, so glad I found you, because I want to be about her. You know, I don't need to do the whole politics of the whole entire, I don't think I'm going to read Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. I'm just going to read about like these particular people. So yeah, right now I'm deep in the research. Like I said, a little too distracted to do my writing until, I don't know, there's a vaccine or something. But in the meantime, I can research. So what, are you working on something, TaraShea? Do you like that question or hate that question?
I used to be so eager to talk about this book when it was in its beginning processes, when I was touring for the first book. And then when I was writing this book, like more into it, I was like, I'm never talking about a project again. Convinced that I had like popped the or something, and I was letting the air slowly seep out of it. But that's not true. I'm so happy with the book that came out of it. So it's not as if I don't love my book. I actually do. And it's not even mine anymore. It's its own being. But yeah, so it's interesting that you can find that you have the focus for research, but not the writing. And I find that I can write, but I can't research. So I don't have, and I should preface this by saying that I have 2 children under the age of 5 at home with me right now, and I have a full-time job. So that's probably what's happening, is that I'm just like, I know I don't have time to research, but I can like take a couple of notes here and there. Before the pandemic, I was in a similar place of having 2 ideas that I was working into, and one was research heavy, set in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm a little scared to say anything more because of my fear about letting the energy out of it. But I would say that it's set in the Pacific Northwest at the turn of the century. And I was in Washington State researching last summer and writing into it. And it's a great story. I mean, the materials that I found are really fascinating. But when I came back, so I was like, I love the materials, the actual letters, more than I think I love my own writing. Like I was like, the gaps here are what's really good. So I have to settle with that. And because I moved back to Ohio, which is where I was born and where I never thought I would return to, and I teach at Miami University and I love the students, I'm much more compelled by a sense of place and identity maybe, but like where I've grown up and where I wanted to leave, but where I've returned and see it in a different way. And so I thought I was going to be writing about, I think I am, a matrilineal line of women that's really closely informed by the experience of the women in my family who were, you know, had children at 17 and had like, just like a lot of resilience. I casually was mentioning to my mom, because I had an aunt who was in and out of jail and had a lot of hard things happen, and it aligned with a relationship I have with my own cousin where like I kind of sort of got out and she didn't. I was talking to my mom and she casually just the other day said, well, if you come by, and by she means come over to her apartment complex and she'll stick her head out the window and I'll talk to her from afar because it's a pandemic. If you come by, I will throw down your aunt's diary. And I was like, my aunt's diary? Like you have this diary from 1975 you haven't been telling me about? This aunt who was like, how a lot of things happened to her. And so she threw it, so I came by and she threw it down and she's like, I also just threw in my diary from the same time period. So I'm like, okay. So I have my mom's diary and my aunt's diary, and they're wrapped in a grocery bag. And because she's like, wait 2 weeks before you open it. Because in seriousness, my mom works in healthcare, so she's like worried about, you know, what could or not pass through. So it's on my shelf and I'm supposed to wait 2 weeks and then open it. And I'm sort of terrified, I don't know, but something about that. I'm writing a lot of essays, and I think it's because they're all mostly set about returning, reckoning with home. And it's just another way for me to think about it and then potentially apply it to a character. You said you started teaching nonfiction and then moved. And similarly, I think. So we'll see.
So there's a great question in the chat from Kimberly, which is one of the things that I often wonder about with writers, actually all the time. I live with a writer and I wonder about this question with him, which is, how do you stop yourself from going down the rabbit hole of research when writing historical fiction? It seems there could be no end to it, and the creation of fiction might take the back burner.
Yeah. Yeah, I can start if you want. I know with Bachelor Girl, so Jacob Ruppert owned the New York Yankees. Well, when I was a kid, I think my dad took me to a Mets game. Like, I'm just not a huge baseball person. And I was so paranoid about the New York Yankees baseball stuff, because I know people who are into the New York Yankees are really into the New York Yankees. And I've read so much for a while. I was like, I knew all about Babe Ruth. And I guess what happens is there's a point at which the research is a lot of material and discover. So like today with Fraulein Gertrude Slotka, I was like, I'm so glad I was researching today. And then there's a point at which you have to stop. So like this book is not an authoritative history of the New York Yankees baseball team. And really the main audience for historical fiction is not necessarily baseball fanatics, although this book has a lot of good baseball in it. But the things that I stumbled across that I really liked about Babe Ruth was like his relationship with his second wife, Claire. His first wife, they were separated, but he wouldn't divorce her because they were Catholic, even though he had already somehow talked his first wife, Babe Ruth talked his first wife into adopting his own illegitimate daughter from a different relationship. And then when the first wife died in a house fire, Babe Ruth and his second wife, Claire, adopted that daughter, and she wrote her own memoir that I read. She didn't even know till she was like an adult that any of this had even happened. So those are the things I tend to get interested in when I'm doing the research, but I also had to get a lot of baseball stuff right. And the first baseball game in this novel is an imaginary one, because I needed all my main characters to like come together at one, like on the same page, on the same day. And so I pushed a few things around, but after that first fictional baseball game, they're all actually true. And I learned how to read a box score so I could have the right score for the game. And so with the thing I'm working on now, I mean, World War II, my gosh, you know, you could like stay in that rabbit hole for a million years. And I'm just really trying to be conscious of, it's not a dissertation. I wrote a dissertation. It wasn't a popular dissertation, but I got my degree. And these are not dissertations. The important thing is to have the confidence as a fiction writer to convey something where the reader can't quite tell what's the difference between the fiction and the history. And then like my agent reminds me, is like, if you know, they could just go to Wikipedia. You don't have to teach every history lesson. So that's the other thing I remind myself. So I'll read a passage in a book I wrote and I'm like, oh man, that sentence, I wrote a whole book to write that one sentence. I don't know if anybody else in the world will know. There's a point that Helen is planning a party at Eagles Rest, and she's putting together the guest list of the New York Yankees. And she goes, well, obviously we're not going to invite Carl Mays. Like, does anybody in this room know why? Like, Carl Mays would be like not on your party list. So yeah, you can go in that rabbit hole, but it generates unexpected things. So you have to follow it for a while.
It's really comforting to hear you describe it like that, because then I feel less alone. Because I think everything you've just described, I would agree with. Particularly the sense of wanting to get it right, and then at some point going like, okay, I often feel like I've ingested enough. Like I have, and the way that I know that I've ingested enough is when the same event, I can see like at least 2 or 3 perspectives on how it could be interpreted differently. And I also think, even though I'm writing a novel in fiction, I am interpreting. So instead of writing my dissertation, I'm writing the fiction in which the indentured servant says X about William Bradford, or reminds the audience that this wasn't the first murder, that Miles Standish had committed the first murder, or like the ways that they had so many deaths that first winter that they would prop the bodies up against trees so it looked like a forest sentinel. Like all of those details. I mean, I love that research could bring me that. Like that's a direct quote from a letter that Phineas Pratt wrote regarding his time at Plymouth and what the stories people were telling him. So on the one hand, it's like it's the archives are oftentimes there are points that are much more interesting than my imagination could ever create. And it's usually at the turn of language, the actual phrasing. And then at other times, they're so silent that I love that I'm actually interpreting just by creating the scene and the story that gives you something different. But in terms of how much of a rabbit hole or how much research, I think in the early stages, I'm researching and kind of writing simultaneously and know I'm getting a ton of things wrong. In the middle, I'm trying to forget what I know or fully ingest it. And then at the end, I'm frantically researching again. So the ARC, the advanced review copy, is missing about 20 rough pages of detail that came in the final book, because I was doing so much research at the last minute about Indian deeds and what was happening in terms of the setup towards King Philip's War. And like, I was like, I have to get all this right, but I didn't have it in time for the ARC. So, but like, I think trusting yourself that you're in a conversation with the past rather than recreating the past, I think aligns with what you're saying, Kim, about like kind of trusting yourself to tell a story.
I love the way you say that you're in a conversation with the past, because it's, yeah, otherwise like you could read a history book, and history books are also interpretive and incomplete and have only certain perspectives and not other perspectives. But you go to historical fiction because you want to engage your imagination and you want that narrative to bring you into a time and through that time. And then, yeah, all those details, tying bodies to the trees to pretend you had more soldiers, that was amazing, you know? And you're right, there's these details you couldn't have imagined. And I agree with you. I do a lot of research to know kind of what story I can tell. And then I kind of block out, sort of outline the story. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know anything. And then I do more research again. And so Janet Burroway wrote a book called Imaginative Writing that I use when I'm teaching creative writing. And for historical fiction, her advice is like, don't take notes, just let yourself forget. And the things that stick with you will be the things that really like speak to you. And then you can always go back, like you said, and check those facts and fill in those details. But yeah, you're not writing a history book, you're writing a novel, and the story and the characters have to be first. Otherwise, people don't have that experience, the fiction experience.
We don't have all that much time left, but that brought up a question that I had for both of y'all. And you already mentioned Sarah Waters, and Fingersmith, which of course is a great novel. Is there any other historical fiction novelists that either of you would like to recommend?
For myself, I reread Ragtime every few years to kind of like gin up my courage for historical fiction. Because Yale Doctoral, Ragtime is as much about the 1970s as it is about the 1920s, and the kind of like bravado and the sense that you don't even know what's true or not true, and that he can like take historical figures and just like do crazy fictional things with them. So for me, that's one. Sarah Waters is one, and then Ragtime in particular is another touchstone for me. Mary Renault and the ancient Greek work that she did, really it's kind of about the confidence. It's like, all right, I'm never going to have every fact right. I didn't actually live then, but you feel that connection and it feels true to you, and you have to tell that true story that's in you.
I think that when I'm looking for a novel, I started as a poet and I have an MFA in poetry. And so when I'm looking at a novel, one of the first things I'm looking for is a strong attention to the sentence, because it's suggesting to me like a precision at the sentence level, and then that expands out to precision in the novel as a whole. And one of my stylism, but I feel like stylist undermines actually what is happening at that level. But I really enjoy Laird Hunt's novel Never Home. If you don't know, he teaches at Brown, and he wrote this book called Never Home, which is set in the Civil War, and it's based on true stories of women who would dress as men to go fight in the Civil War. And it's really wonderful in terms of the way that it enters in a story from a perspective that you might not have heard of, but it's also just so well written and so much care. And I think because my sense of time is limited right now, I have this real love for the novella, or the shorter novel that with a lot of precision gets at something super big. I like Eye to Tuba, Black Witch of Salem. I read a lot of nonfiction though, even more than I read historical novels. I love diaries, memoirs, lyric essays like Maggie Nelson, things like that.
I just, the thing that made me cry a couple of days ago, I just read a book by Philip Mechanicus. He was a journalist who was interned in the Westerbork transit camp in the Netherlands for over a year. And every day he wrote every day. And just all these details of his personal experience. And he was a great writer, and this is in translation, so the translator deserves a lot of credit too. But yeah, I really relate to that. And I love Never Home. I know that book. It's really great. If you guys are looking for your next historical novel, Laird Hunt, Never Home, absolutely.
So we've got actually someone asking us to list the books you mentioned. I'm going to try to type them up in the chat. Or maybe David, you can try to, if you have a good memory for everything. TaraShea, thank you for jumping in. I know Mary Renault was one of them, who I adore.
Yeah.
And
The Persian Boy is my favorite.
That one of hers I've actually not read. I should pick that up because I've read a few. Mm-hmm. And then Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow. Mm-hmm. Which I went back in my New York City days. I did an event with him, I think around the anniversary of that book, which was really remarkable. He just, sometimes you spend time speaking with someone and they just are on this whole other level of brilliance, and that was really him. He was quite remarkable. So I think we are closing in on about how much time we have this evening. Thank you both, Kim and TaraShea, for being here. This was really a great pleasure for me to hear from both of you about your wonderful work. And thank you, everybody, for being here. It's really a great joy to me to see all of your faces and check in and know that we're all still here and still reading. So thank you all for being here, and have a lovely rest of your evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you.
Alkemade's book is The Orphan Girl. TaraShea Nesbit's is Beheld. Thanks a lot.
Orphan, it's actually Kim's is Orphan number 8, and then Bachelor Girl, who are completing her 2 books together.
You can read them both.
But thank you guys. Yes.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.